Toxic masculinity is a myth. It's a bold claim and also one that will likely spur a noticeable amount of backlash in the comment section, but today I want to propose that the term, or rather buzzword, of toxic masculinity, when considering its modern and widespread common usage, is a fabrication that does not and cannot mean anything substantial outside of its utilization as a highly subjective slur or insult. This isn't strictly speaking gaming related, and this is typically a gaming channel, that's true, but recently I've seen the term thrown around with regard to gaming specifically a hefty amount, and there are also numerous tie-ins, so it felt like a functional and relatively connected topic even despite its wide-ranging concept. But anyways, now onto the actual video. To understand why it is a fabricated keyword, or to be more precise, a keyword that has lost all true, legitimate, or meaningful definition, we must first understand what it is intended to mean. Toxic masculinity is a repressive method of describing modern manhood. The buzzword signifies a measurement scale where physicality, sex, and stoic resolve are often used in replacement of emotional factors. Toxic masculinity is also directly compared to societal feminine traits, such as perceived emotional awareness or vulnerability. Common and stereotypical masculine tendencies often relate to physical power. Regardless of whether they are biologically or societally driven, their origin could be debated from either side and is likely a combination of both. The key takeaway is that toxic masculinity, better defined as hyper-masculinity in my eyes, is a phenomenon wherein men view themselves as a physical protector or a monolith of simultaneous physical and emotional strength, with an obligation and duty to perform the responsibilities associated with that status, void of weakness, both perceived and actual. As a result, standard interactions can often be viewed through this lens. Small or insignificant events may elicit a reaction of bravado, or inversely, apathy. Competition can be ramped up and physicality used as a social communication tool by hyper-masculine men, and the resulting peer-to-peer interactions are often referred to as toxic masculinity, with the underlying sneer of there being an inherent detriment or general inferiority to them through the perceived lack of clarity, depth, or emotional expression. Essentially, being macho or exemplifying the widespread historical norm when it comes to typical male roles in society is now often referred to as toxic masculinity, with the direct intention to insult and degrade those to whom it is addressed. This is not to claim that the phrase always had such an antagonistic meaning. In fact, the origin of the term harkens back to self-reflection done by men in an effort to self-improve and emotionally evolve. A 2012 TED Talk by Jackson Katz does an excellent job of framing the core principles behind what toxic masculinity originally referred to, and also asks pertinent questions with the intention to build awareness and impact cognitive development in a positive way. But, unfortunately, over the past few years, the term has morphed into a dysfunctional version of what it once referred to, and is now nothing more than a mythical and pejorative insult leveled at any man who diverges from, or fails to fully align with, modern feminist agendas. Now, to understand the relationship between modern feminism and toxic masculinity, we have to examine the evolution of what feminism truly is. I will consolidate the description down as much as possible because it is a very long history involving multiple waves, goals, and accomplishments. But the key takeaway is that feminism has rapidly been evolving for years, both in mission and result. At the inception of feminism as a movement, there were a host of repressive societal issues for women as a whole. Large structural inequalities were the main target for that movement, and during the early generations, feminists tackled a number of monumental issues that had long remained steadfast as commonly accepted law or expectation. As a very simple visual, we can think of feminism as an expanding circle here, combating any issue it comes in contact with under the directive of pursuing equality. Early issues, and very important ones I might add, included the right to vote, or the right to autonomously sign contracts, the right to exist as an individual rather than a possession, and the right to choose a husband rather than be forced to marry against their will. These issues came in contact with the expanding directive of feminism and were changed for the better, but the expanding circle continues to grow. Over time, the vast majority of important and meaningful issues were transformed, but the expansion was not slowing down, it was picking up speed. And now, there were not large, fundamental issues in its path. There were increasingly trivial slights or inequalities that, on occasion, were not even detrimental, but rather respectful or chivalrous. This brings us to modern-day feminism. Modern-day feminism has wiped out the overwhelming majority of legitimate issues. Some still remain, to be sure, and are rightfully a focus of the movement, but most are gone. However, the circle still expands, seeking smaller and smaller targets to compensate for the void of legitimate issues, by attacking with increasing ferocity. When taking aim at a concept as important as women's suffrage, a certain degree of intensity is to be expected. Not only is it expected, it is necessary, but when shifting forward multiple generations, having eliminated most of the truly resolute societal inequalities, the same level of ferocity aimed at tiny and insignificant issues is a malignant phenomenon that only serves to create unrest. The idea that chivalry is dead is formed on a basis of truth, because chivalry is a long-standing tradition of male expectations, rooted in masculinity that has been vindictively persecuted by modern-day feminists. Chivalry, generally speaking, is dead because feminism, lacking an adequate number of meaningful targets while still possessing all of the intensity and passion, killed it. Here is where I will briefly tell a story. An anecdotal story that should not be used as a pristine measuring tape of modern feminism, to be sure, but a story that indicates a typical experience that many men and women have had, while underlining the progression from meaningful to insignificant focus material. A few years ago, I was walking into a store. Across from me was a woman whom I did not know. I had no idea who she was. Probably early 20s and rather attractive. We were approaching the door at the same time, and rather than awkwardly get to the door at precisely the same moment, only to fumble with how we would then be traversing through that door, I took one or two slightly hurried steps to get there first, opened the door, stood back, and nodded to signify she could go first. To me, this was entirely normal. Not only is it annoyingly awkward reaching for things at the same time as others, but it is a long-standing norm for me to hold the door for other people, generally speaking. It's just how I was raised. I expected her to perhaps smile, say thank you, I don't know, and walk through, or even to ignore my presence entirely and just continue with her day, which is fairly normal as well. But to my surprise, neither. Her face started turning beet red and she nearly screamed at me, "I don't need a man to do things for me," before storming off through the door I was still holding, mind you. I was essentially in shock. Of every possible reaction, that would never have been my guess. Now, it's entirely possible she was having a horrible day, and there is a totally understandable reason behind her severe reaction. But not knowing what that reason is, or if it even exists, I was thinking to myself, wow, okay, so next time I should just slam the door in a bitch's face. In calm hindsight, I can analyze the situation and understand that even though this was a delusional response to an insignificant thing, I should not extract that into a broader interpretation of women as a whole. But the underlying point is that something I consider to be normal, almost meaningless and polite, as well as ever so slightly a respectful thing to do for a woman, holding the door open, seems normal, to her was possibly a sexist, insulting, and unacceptable thing worthy of extremely vocal and loud backlash. This illustrates the idea of an expanding circle that maintains all of the ferocity. With a lack of meaningful things to fight against, for her specifically, it resulted in someone holding the door taking the brunt of her anger, and perhaps it's a fluke or misdirected anger, but the manifestation was very specific, and there are numerous other examples. Recently, a story ran through many different gaming news outlets relating to a female gamer named Ellie. The story asserted that Ellie was an esports Overwatch player who had quit her pro team after being harassed, and the community at large had questioned her identity. The story is a horrific piece of journalistic garbage, asserting that gamers are inherently sexist, that the event is indicative of larger issues, and that esports is not a meritocracy, it is filled with gender essentialism running rampant. Well, it turns out the account named Ellie was fake all along. The player behind it was a man, meaning that claims asserting Ellie was not who they claimed to be, that is to say, not in fact a female esports player, and effectively an imposter, were entirely 100% accurate. This did not stop a horde of mainstream gaming news media from jumping on the story at lightning speed. Their immediate interpretation and response, despite widespread and vocal concern that the account, backed by a decent spread of evidence as well, I might add, was not in fact a real player, was to spread the outspoken message that gamers are sexist, and doubting the legitimacy of this fake account was a misogynistic thing to do. This yet again illustrates the expanding need for targets that can be branded as sexist, misogynistic, or prejudicial. With a widespread elimination of large and more meaningful hurdles, small issues, or even speculative potential small issues, are swept up in the fury and beaten down mercilessly even before any real clarity has emerged. And this, finally, brings us back to our original buzzword. As a term, toxic masculinity has been weaponized by modern feminism and now fulfills its role as a subjective, targeted slur meant to degrade men who display masculine tendencies. 7 or 8 years ago, the term was directed primarily at true detrimental behavior, such as domestic violence, and used in a meaningful, self-reflecting way. But now, it is a bludgeon for even the most trivial of behaviors that intersect with the expanding event horizon of modern feminist anger. This is where we must examine a core hypocrisy. Toxic masculinity, better described as hyper-masculinity in my opinion, is a very polarized phenomenon. In an increasingly docile world, it seems out of place, but in a violent or dangerous world, it is ultimately very necessary and valuable. The safety and privilege that we all enjoy was primarily built on the engine of what is now considered to be toxic. There is an obvious phenomenon where acts of heroism born from a societally reinforced protector mentality are praised highly and honored. As an example, during an extremely tragic event in California where many were killed, a group of men formed a protective circle around women, shielding them from bullets with their own bodies. This behavior was very deliberate. This was not a random grouping where men just happened to shield women from death. This is not a situation where the opposite would have also been true if simulated again. This was the result of masculine upbringing in which these men were raised with the belief set imparted upon them that they should protect women, that they are to use their physicality for a purpose, and that when thrust into a situation of pure danger and risk, that they should put women first before themselves and their own very lives. This is not the only example. A social expectation of having no fear or the imperative protection of others, especially women, are extremely masculine tendencies, and one of their manifestations is to shield those that are vulnerable from danger and death. These acts are never referred to as toxically masculine, and you will never see modern feminism decry these acts as prejudicial, but the truth is that these societal expectations that men and women are different, while men have an inherent duty or responsibility to protect women, is born of a rudimentary belief that they are not in fact equal. However, unlike the modern version of feminism that cannot differentiate between positive and negative discrepancies, not all inequality is fundamentally bad. Think of the age-old expression, when the ship sinks, women and children first. This historical mindset is born of inequality. All things being truly equal, there would be no differentiation between men and women, meaning every individual family would have to make some complex decision for the child's well-being in the heat of the moment, which is not an optimal strategy. This is an instance where inequality leads to women surviving and men dying. But would the same mindset of radically eliminating all inequality be applied to this standard as well? No. It isn't, because this particular mindset and manifestation of masculinity, even as a direct result of being raised through traditional masculine methods, which are widely regarded now as toxic, is viewed by radical feminists as beneficial. Society is rapidly evolving around us. Faster than ever before, societal expectations shift and transform. A great deal of what we consider to be masculine, or feminine for that matter, is influenced or programmed by societal norms, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But a problem arises when the expectation of what is acceptable, unacceptable, prejudicial, or tolerant moves so quickly that large groups and even generations are left behind. We live in a world where conflict, even in just the last decade or two, has dramatically shifted away from physicality towards technology. There is still a definite need for physically powerful individuals to defend our country, or any country for that matter, under certain circumstances, but the time when wars were decided by the sheer number of physical combatants has most likely come to an end. During the First and Second World Wars, there was a defined and ultimate adversary. When a society possesses a clearly defined enemy, it has a rallying point that serves to maintain order. Looking at modern-day America, however, we can see no such clarity. There are enemies, to be sure, but none so well defined as a foreign nation or alliance clearly positioning itself to immediately threaten everything we hold dear. In reality, such threats almost certainly exist, but on a surface level, this lack of a well-defined and less visible enemy, even if there were to be one in actuality, eliminates the unifying emphasis on physicality and cooperation as a defense, allowing an individual society to fracture and seek new enemies within itself. For the entirety of human evolution, both physical and societal, masculinity has had a clearly defined purpose. Hunting, surviving, protecting, or fighting. These requirements were also more prominent and more frequent as well. But now, with the rapid societal shift, what was once a glorified, necessary, valuable, and important phenomenon has largely become the subjective recipient of ridicule and admonishment through keyword drivel such as toxic masculinity. Societal expectations, at least recently, have changed faster than the natural flow of human upbringing or instruction. The result is that men are often raised in what is viewed as entirely normal circumstances for their own family, and would never have been assumed as uncommon a few years ago, but then enter society and face ridicule for what they have never even considered to be out-of-place behavior, such as basic masculine tendencies, now regarded by the ever-expanding sphere of feminist outrage as toxically masculine. Toxic masculinity is better defined as hyper-masculine activity. The original definition was meant to refer to legitimately harmful behavior, but harmful behavior has never been and never will be restricted to masculine or feminine tendencies alone. Harmful behavior is its own prefix. Now, however, the buzzword of toxic masculinity refers to anything perceived as stereotypically masculine, and is used in a sneering, ignorant, and insulting way by feminists seeking to find a resilient enough target so that they are not just screaming into the void. The buzzword toxic masculinity is accompanied by many others just like it. Things like mansplain, which now subjectively just refers to any time a man says anything a woman doesn't like or wants him to stop talking because she thinks she is correct or has a superior right to speak. The proper term is explain, which is a gender neutral phenomenon occurring in almost every single debate throughout history. But these buzzwords are designed to shut down reasonable discourse in a snide and damaging way. Toxic masculinity in particular is a myth, where once it referred to something legitimate, it has now been perverted to such an extreme it is detrimental to meaningful discourse and has no actual meaning. And anyone using the term, unironically, is contributing to a societally chaotic trend that does nothing but damage peer-to-peer interactions, especially across genders, by bludgeoning anyone they disagree with using their ignorant, manipulated, subjective insults that no longer hold any value or meaning whatsoever. But that's it. That's already more than enough. And I anticipate a decent amount of screeching as a result of these, in my opinion, clearly articulated positions. But such is the nature of modern interactions on the internet, I suppose. If you want to support the channel, check out the links down below. There's a bunch of different ways, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. Thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.